What is good leadership, what is bad leadership, seeing this firsthand has led me to get deeply immersed into wanting to find an answer for this.
What are some of the key leadership challenges do you see that is most solvable?
Being able to bring people's attention to what's causing decay. People do see that there's a problem, but they still don't want to do anything about it.
In Asian context or in countries that are new to democracy, maybe it's not their culture to be speaking out against the authorities.
I always tell leaders who are managers, who are directors, who are overseeing a group of 10 people, 50 people, you are still in the position of influence. You have the power to create a microculture, at least within your unit, within your department. This is Samuel Kim. I'm the president of the Center for Asian Leadership. You are listening to the Innovation Civilization podcast.
All right, Samuel, welcome to the Innovation Civilization podcast. What a great pleasure to have you here today.
Well, thank you so much, Wahid, for having me here.
Brilliant. So, Samuel, let's get started with what you do, really. So, you've said your early experiences convinced you that nations rise and fall with the quality of leadership, right? So, and you've had a colorful background, spending a bit of time in the West as well. So what specifically pushed you to found the Center for Asia Leadership in 2014? Like, what are you trying to solve, basically?
Yeah, I think in order to ask that question, I think that's an excellent question. I kind of need to go back to my youth days. My parents were humanitarian workers. And the very first country that took me out of Korea, where I hail from, is the Philippines. And the Philippines, at one point in time, was Korea's role model. We wanted to become like the Philippines. Korea was one of the poorest countries in Asia and possibly the world. And we had a long, possibly about 7 decades of what we call a very difficult moments. We're under the Japanese colonial rules, followed by the Korean War. And we had about 2 decades of political instability. But, when I was 10, when I moved to the Philippines, what I heard growing up, right? We wanted to become like the Philippines, but when I went there as a 10-year-old, I kind of witnessed something different. A country that used to be a role model. And what I saw was that, there were people walking in the streets without shoes, kids who are of my age not going to school. And I was kind of asking that question, what happened to a country that once a country like Korea used to wanted to become, right? And, that 10 years of my journey living in the Philippines and also other parts of Asia, again, the countries that Korea all wanted to become, they were really, one of those countries that we used to look upon. But what I witnessed with my eyes firsthand was not the reality that, perhaps I wanted to become. And I began asking the question, what happened to these communities? What is leadership? What has caused this to happen? And so that's where sort of my very binary form of inquiry began. So what is good leadership? What is bad leadership? And just kind of seeing this firsthand has led me to get deeply immersed into, wanting to find an answer for this. Later on, I went to college, and then my first job was working at the United Nations. And there it was all different countries coming together, in New York. And at the time, it was a twin tower falling down. We had all kinds of very tough moments happening all over the world. I think at the time, I was one of the youngest diplomats. And what I witnessed was about 40 over conflicts around the world. We've got a lot of humanitarian crises. We had so much problems happening around the world. There I witnessed again, there are really smart people coming to United Nations to wanting to solve a problem, but it was also the human arrogance and ignorance that was really causing, being an impediment to solving this. You had the national interest, you had all these different, complications that made it very difficult to solve this. And while, all these problems were getting worse. So I witnessed that, here, this is another avenue that requires leadership as well. And then kind of fast forward, I was in the military as an officer. I did my own startup and then my nonprofit, as well as witnessing the 2008 financial crisis, where the 153-year-old company that I was part of had fallen, right? And again, just kind of that journey about 15 over years, or maybe close to about 20 years, there's so much insight about what is good leadership and what does really leadership mean? Who is a leader? Does a history make a leader or history makes a leader? So really around that theme of leadership, I've been really thinking deeply about this. And eventually the current work I have been doing for the past decade has culminated with writing a book on this theme around the adaptive leadership. Leadership matters and ultimately what does leadership should be achieving by the end of the day, right? And what kind of providing some insights about why organizations or countries either get stuck or go into the form of a decay. What are some of the things that we should do in order to continue to lead our communities, our countries, organizations through a path leading to a growth, right? Growth, meaningful growth. And so that was, basically where the whole journey about leadership has led to.
Yeah.
And here I am,
That's quite interesting, actually, like the fact that you said that you've got a bit of background in working for nonprofit sort of institutions, the military, for-profit, and I'm sure their leadership styles and formats and contexts are different, yet there are like common threads among them and so on and so forth. So from your experience and training like 50,000 plus individuals across, many, many countries, so what are some of the key leadership kind of challenges do you see that is most solvable? Like it's a low-hanging fruit, but no one really goes and kind of resolves it.
Wahid, I think that's an excellent question, and I really want to answer that question, probably like given time, the time I have. But I want to begin with this. I think when it comes to leadership, the way I define leadership is being able to bring people's attention to what's causing decay, right? The reality that's causing decay to happen. The reality that's broken apart, our broken reality. Perhaps maybe we might be paying attention to leadership that's kind of happy, that's attractive, that's very charismatic. But the way I want to define leadership is the ability to mobilize people's attention, to pay attention to what's breaking apart. We should really pay attention to the reality that's already broken apart, but also the causes that lead to decay. Because ultimately, when everything's all great, we tend to overlook, we tend to either we forget about what's causing, what might be causing us to decay, because there may be some things that we may be forgetting, that, the blind spots, for example. But while everyone is happy, cheering for all the great things that's happening around, I think, a leader should be able to really pay attention to what's falling apart and being able to encourage people to think about, guys, I think, it's great to celebrate, but at the same time, we got to pay attention to what's, breaking apart. And sometimes the response, I've seen 4 common responses. One, people sometimes do not see, and therefore they do nothing about it. When I see something, it means that they're not able to see what's falling apart, what's breaking apart, and therefore they do nothing about it. Mm-hmm. Another response is that people do see that there's a problem, but they still don't want to do anything about it. Either they ask other people, maybe people, hire the authority to do something about it. It's not my thing to do it, right? So these are really people who are very fixated on the job scope, right? It's not my thing to do, right? Mm-hmm. And so therefore, even though I see it, if there is a problem, I see the elephant in the room, they still don't do anything about it. Another response I saw was that they see that there's a problem, but they put up a wrong response, right? Wrong response, meaning that they point fingers. They try to look for people to blame, The problem that you see now, it didn't happen because of me. It's got to be someone else, right? Mm-hmm. So they start blaming people, scapegoating, and this is what I call a distraction. They somehow get trapped into this distraction, and they waste their time and energy to solving that problem that they see. Instead, using that to, get into politics and so forth. Maybe another response I saw was that there is a problem, but, they have a delayed response. They just wait, expecting that the time will solve the problem until that problem that has never been fixed, that has never, had been overlooked, gets even worse, right? Until a point where things are becoming more of a bigger problem. So I think before we get there, I've worked with many organizations. I've worked with different governments and countries where, especially with companies that used to do really, really well, right? Because they failed to address these 4 types of response, in which I call it again leadership, drawing people's attention to what's breaking apart, what can cause to fall apart, has led to a decay. They either filed a bankruptcy, that company has been sold off, even a country level, right? The country that used to do so well, where people are somehow wasting all their time and energy pointing fingers and somehow never have really get to the bottom of the problem and have lost the time, where people have left, these talents leaving the country, and somehow they have really fallen into that trajectory of decay, right? Or There are some countries that are, they have so much with it, right? They're so blessed with so many different things, but they're somehow stuck, right? And so I felt that, again, leadership is really about how do we really bring people's attention while at the same time we celebrate the good things that we do, how do we really draw people's attention? And you have to be very creative, because if we don't do this so well, then instead of your effort wanting to help people focus on the problem, instead you could be a problem. People may be pointing fingers at you. We should be all celebrate. Why are you bringing these negative vibe into it? And so you got to be really creative, and you have to be very political in how you do things, approach that you take. So you have to be quite savvy in terms of how you really do that. And so I know that this is a long question, but that's how I want to approach when it comes to that. And then just one quickly, I think whether it be an Asian form of leadership or maybe a Western form of leadership, think, by definition is that's the objective. That's the purpose of your leadership, but maybe there may be subtly different ways of doing it. Maybe in the West, you could be a little bit more vocal about it. But in Asia, you want to ensure that you don't want to lose people's face. And so you want to do maybe this on a one-on-one first, kind of plant the seed here. And maybe you want to have a little bit more time, right? So maybe you might take a different approach to how you do it. But ultimately, your exercise leadership really has to bring people's attention to what can cause decay to.
We'll come to some of the other differences, basically. So what you're saying is, like, the leader has to be a bit of an observant. Can it be like a pessimist in some ways to begin with, just to kind of shine a spotlight on the decay, like you said, but then work around and convince people and mobilize people? That's the sort of kind of right response of leadership, along with the other things like the technical acumen and the charisma you need, and so on and so forth, right? Does that kind of in a nutshell summarize what you're sort of trying to mention?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think if you are able to have what I call the formal authority and the informal authority, I think that can really help you. Maybe you are in the position of influence, and maybe you are the highest person up, or maybe you have the title, for example. That can give you a bit of an authority to do that. That can make it easier to do it. But sometimes the informal authority, which is more of the respect and the trust that you have with people. I think the informal authority is the ability to be heard. And I think if you have both of that, that can really help you, right? Because people know the intention of it. Sometimes, and again, as I mentioned to you, the timing is important. And I call this the ripening of time. You might, want to observe, what we may be missing. People may be somehow too obsessed with the successes of your organization. You're all about celebrating now. You're all about thinking about the positive side. But at the same time, again, you have to be able to really, ensure that you have that momentum and the positive vibe. But at the same time, you might want to tell people, right? Hey, guys, even though this is one thing, there's also another thing that we got to pay attention. Let's not be blinded by our success. It's going to be very important that we need to pay attention to some of these things that could really, cause a negative impact or consequence, right? So it's kind of a way doing both of that. And then perhaps your title and your respect, will be very helpful.
Yeah, I'm just curious to know about authorities, right? Because you mentioned formal and informal authorities, but there's this concept called power distance.
Yes.
And you're fully aware, and to our audience as well, it's characterized by how high you are in the organization or society. And sometimes especially in Asian context, that leads to a centrality of superiority or of decision making. So you mentioned just now Philippines, but I would like to add that Malaysia is also ranked among the top when it comes to power distance. And a lot of other countries who are in the top 20 rank of having such power distance would be mostly countries that are still new in practicing democracy or relatively underdeveloped. So my question to you, Summer, is how do we shift the leadership culture that often cuts across not just political, economic, but also to a certain extent cultural as well? Because in Asian context or in countries that are new to democracy, maybe it's not their culture to be speaking out against the authorities, for example.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question too. I think that in countries like Korea, where I'm from, and like Malaysia, and you mentioned about the Philippines, I think in these countries' context, it's going to be very difficult for people who are young and people who are relatively, low in ranks, maybe wanting to do that because they might have a big pushback. So I think it's going to be very important that leaders, the role of the leaders are really critical. They should really be the ones, because it's quite hierarchical and it's very top down. And it's going to be very important that the leaders in the organization should be able to create that kind of culture, And even though you cannot, I always tell leaders who are managers, who are directors, who are overseeing, I don't know, 10, a group of 10 people, 50 people, I tell them that you are still in the position of influence, that you have the power to create a microculture with, at least within your unit, within your department. So you can actually try to create that, a microculture, right? That can work within your organization, that people are able to freely speak up. Because sometimes we can call it the trust equation, where, in the trust equation, you talk about the reliability, credibility, and intimacy. Intimacy is really about making people feel comfortable and safe to talk. If you don't feel safe and comfortable to talk, people will never speak up. And a lot of the great ideas that are different perspective, different ideas actually can come, irrespective of, your length of, duration of, your time in the organization, irrespective of your age. People have different ideas. And one of the clients I work with is in Korea, and I can say Samsung, for example. The foldable phone, right? The foldable phone came out, the idea came out 7 years before it came out, to the world. There were ideas that were, the idea that was brought by were people who are in the early 20s. They had that system, the culture, where people are able to channel this up, right? It was very top down. It was not really bottom up until the moment where they had small crises and they had to go through that cultural transformation where people are able to speak up. And so leaders who are in the high up, whether you like it or not, times are changing. The quicker that you help to adopt, that you're able to bring a new culture in, whether you're from the west or east, it doesn't really matter. The quicker that you do that, the quicker that the earlier that you promote, your organization has higher chances of surviving, right? In the these uncertainties that we face. Or if you can't do that, then even in the capacity of your own, in your units, your departments, you still are in the position of influence. You still have the power to create that microculture, right? And then you do that, right?
Yeah. The example that you mentioned about the hierarchy basically affecting the sort of Asian-centric countries and so on and so forth versus the Western one, which is a bit more flat. So what you're saying is that the leader should create that more flatter kind of environment. And to me, the pinnacle of the problem of extreme hierarchy, I'm reminded of something like Mao Zedong in the 1950s. At the Great Famine, basically, where all people beneath him were misreporting the grain production numbers, right? Just to kind of appease the leader on the top of the hierarchy, exactly, and causing like 30 million deaths out of starvation, right? So that's a kind of example of where like that kind of stuff gets completely wrong, let alone like not having the creative ideas and so on and so forth, but just the truth information not kind of propagating the correct way because of these over politicized hierarchies and so on and so forth, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. I see this in organizations, in different, in Asia, because I work in Asia mostly. I see this. And one thing that I do when I work with different organizations is to observe. I call this diagnostic work. And what I do is I observe. What does the culture here look like? Are people able to freely speak up? Are people able to, and of course, especially in the Asian context, whether you're in the, Western, Eastern context, speaking up is going to be important. But at the same time, you have to do this in a very respectful way, right? So with respect, you're still able to have people speak and to really share the idea. Because I always only mention this, that one of the observations I see is that are people talking about things that people, are that leaders, something that it makes leaders pleasant to hear, right? Something that they want to hear? Or are people able to speak something that are not pleasant? Sometimes this is what you need to hear instead of like, your ears are all used to about, hearing about the things that you want to hear. So if the culture is allowing you, especially the people, in the low ranks are able to freely speak up, that the leaders must hear or need to hear, I think, you have the right culture. And if you're able to do so in a very respectful way, I think, you have a high chances of surviving through and even thriving, through times.
Yeah. So Samuel, you mentioned two things for a good leadership to exist, right? Number one is that you need to create that culture. whatever that's going to be, collaboration, speaking up. And then there's also an assumption that the leader must be able to execute what has been suggested. But oftentimes, sometimes people who are categorized as leaders are there not because of their qualities, but perhaps due to seniority or family
Yes.
connections, or because it's a
Yes.
family-owned company, for example, right?
Mm.
And we have seen often that a
Yes.
lot of people who aim for leadership positions,
Mm.
be it political or corporate companies, they will eventually get there because they really want to achieve that top position.
Mm.
But sometimes people would be confused whether whether they are really leadership qualities exhibited by them, or are they just being very good at being political to get what they want. So it's
Mm.
often intertwined with maybe other complementary abilities that makes
Yes.
people pushed up to the top, right? Like, for example, greed for power, or wanting to have attention, or narcissism. So oftentimes when these people get into those positions, they would fail to deliver what's expected from a leader of that organization, for example. And we've
Mm.
seen even
Mhm.
prime ministers
Mhm.
resigning within weeks, or corporate
Yes.
leaders spending 30
Yes.
years working for the same
Yes.
company only to be
Mhm.
removed within weeks because of fraud,
Yes.
HR violations, corruption, and all that. So how do you explain the situation where people are often mistaken to be a leader just because they are rising fast in organizations, when in fact, when they finally become, or they finally control that authority, they fail to deliver what they expected to do?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I see this quite a lot in the political, the national, the government side of things. I see this relatively less in the corporate side. Of course, they might have like second and third generations coming in, but I'm currently working with second and third generations. But one thing I'm less worried about the corporate side, because even though they may not have the qualities, at least that they have the system in place, or at least that they have this humility in place, right? They know that what they're good at, what they're not good at, and they really are good at using different people. But of course, these people are humble. So making a good use of partners, the allies, to wade through these uncertainties. I think the corporate side is relatively I'm less concerned about. And I think many organizations that I've worked with have done relatively a good job. But in government, it's a different thing. I've seen, especially in politics, where the political power has been passed down from one generation to the other. And personally, I'm not sure if I am being too blatant, but I have seen people who are not so qualified in this position. But because of their parents, they are in that position. And, that's dangerous in a way. It's not only dangerous for the country, but now with the social media, they're getting more exposed, right? Their incapabilities, incapacities, this questionable leadership, traits are putting them more exposed. So at least on one side, the social media is kind of being used as a means or the medium to do a check and balances. But at the same time, this is, another sort of the citizens of the country should be able to take more ownership of what's being done in the country and being able to speak up. We see this right now in different parts of Asia right now. People who are, especially young people who are very enraged with what's happening, right? That reality. And we can call the symptoms. Leaders should be able to pay attention to the symptoms, especially the problematic symptoms. The symptoms are not the problem, but it's an indication, or it's a warning sign, or it's a signal that tells you that there's a deeper problem, right? So, if you don't want to get there, you have to pay attention to the symptoms. And if you are a good leader, you should be able to start telling people that, this is the symptom that you see, and we got to be starting to pay attention to these problematic symptoms that we see right now. Otherwise, it's going to go become very explosive in that regard. And so, yes, I mean, we see that, but, it's also the citizens' responsibility. It's a collective leadership that we have to exercise to ensure that the leaders, especially at the national level, are doing the right thing, right? Ultimately, that benefits the wider public than for their own interest.
Yeah. The thing you mentioned about systems is quite interesting, basically. The corporate way of choosing and electing a leader versus the kind of government way of doing that. And I was just kind of reading this book the other day. I forgot by who this gentleman, I think he's Canadian, but he spent a lot of time in China, and he's basically comparing the US political system and the Chinese one. And I think there's something about the Chinese political system within the Communist Party is that you start off as like a leader or a mayor of a smaller city. You have a certain set of KPIs. You hit those KPIs of like GDP and number of roads and
Very number.
infrastructure created, so on and so forth. And you, based on those like very objective figures, you rise up the ranks. You go to a bigger city, and ultimately you make it to the CCP leadership, right? But if you see the Western style political leadership, even if you're like Bernie Sanders and you're doing an amazing job as a congressman or as a senator in your kind of jurisdiction, you still are not going to be the democratic leader. Like the people have to look at those figures and maybe elect you as a leader. There's going to be campaign funds. You're going to have to campaign. It's like a lot of TikTok messaging, a lot of X.com, and so on and so forth. So it's quite interesting, basically, the system of political election, basically, which also matters rather than just like, what is the pool of leaders that you have, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, leadership, I can say, is that it's really a difficult thing to do, right?
Yeah.
And I say that leadership is a choice. I mean, you can opt to exercise leadership. You don't have to, but I think if you don't exercise leadership, the best that you can do is just manage things. But even with management, how are you going to deal with all kinds of uncertainties? People's preferences are changing. People are watching you all the time. There's so much fake news going around. You have so many battlefronts, right? So the managing things alone is going to be very difficult. And especially if you're in the position of influence and if you're in the position to change system, I think this is where the leadership needs to come in. And so who comes into the position does really matter. And I think it's going to be very important that the citizens should be able to, at least take interest in what's happening in the country. The future of the country, for example, on a country level, right? The destiny, right? The future relies on the choices that we make today. And so therefore, who does that? I mean, the citizens, really have to, take ownership of that. And to ensure that the politicians or the government leaders are able to really, of course, they can make mistakes, by the way, but at least that there are people with good intentions, but people with the bad intentions. And we were able to learn this as time passes by. And as, we have so many different channels that we can learn from about what they do. And so I think it's going to be very important that the wider public needs to continue to hold their eyes on and to see that. And in the leader standpoint, it's going to be very difficult because it's not easy to make decisions. And there's so much uncertainties and especially the unknowns, right? The known knowns and known unknowns, unknown knowns and unknown knowns, right? There's just so much uncertainties that you have to, confront. And you don't really know the decision that you make, whether it be bringing a positive impact. So I think we're going back to the sort of the point that we discussed. If you're able to distribute, or we call this distributed leadership, right? The more we are able to work with different people together, because it's going to become extremely difficult for just one person to make decisions. One person, that decision based on this one person's insight is going to be very risky. And so therefore, leadership is a risky thing. How do you, mitigate the risk is by bringing very good allies with you who share the values, who are able to not only pay only attention to your own faction's interest, but really think about the nation as well. I mean, and again, if you want to do that, one of the courage that you need to have is the courage to speak with people who have different ideas, different visions, different values. I think that's going to be extremely critical, right? Just because of the fact that, nowadays that we see that so many leaders don't talk to each other. So it is very important that we, at least there has to be some people that needs to continue to promote this kind of culture, right? So we cannot just let the few people who are in the highest position to do this. The leadership begins anywhere, at any point in time, irrespective of what kind of title and position that you're in. You can do this within your scope of influence, right? Promoting this microculture that we talk, that we understand, that we, promote these, positive cultures within our own domain of influence. I think that's something that we can do as a regular citizens, right?
Yeah. Samuel, earlier you spoke about having advised second and third generations into family-owned settings, right? And a lot of these people would rely on people who have done it before, people who are experts in their subject matters. So I would think that perhaps what would you advise for this group of individuals who are parachuted into leadership? So now we're no more talking about active leadership or leadership that's based on feedback, but Rather, it's leadership out of entitlement or situations. But at the
Parachutes.
same time, it's very important for them to be able to process and synthesize point of views, and for them to be able to identify among the network of advisors that are helping them out, which one of these will potentially have like conflicted self-interest, for example, especially when in high-stake environments. So, in your experience of dealing with this group of individuals, be it political or in family-owned settings or corporates, how would you approach them differently compared to the more active form of leadership that we have discussed so far?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The people who we so-called are parachutes, people who have been, brought in, they face tremendous pressure, because they have been brought in. They have this pressure that they have to prove themselves, and, they don't have that much time. They need to do something, right? And that's when they are easily like to make mistakes, right? And because, they are in a very vulnerable space, because, when you come in, you don't really have allies with you. You don't have people who have, who had an experience working with you. The level of trust, we're not really sure. People are just kind of watching him or her, so that person is quite lonely. And, well, at the same time, that person is feeling a tremendous pressure as well. So I think one of the things that they should do is that before they giving that impression is going to be important. What kind of impression is that you go in, don't act like that you know it all. Don't act like that you are the expert. The very first thing that, is that you have to exercise humility, and you have to win people's heart. It's going to be extremely, extremely important. The moment you go in, you have to really listen to people. Of course, there are a lot of people who go in acting like they are Superman and Superwoman, but they're going to be exposed to so much different risk that might cause them to a downfall. But I've seen people who have gone in as a parachute, but who have succeeded. And these people are the ones who have gone in and try to listen to people, ask a lot of questions, rather than using the statement that ends with a period or full stop or exclamation point, they're, saying things with a question mark, wanting to hear, listen, I'm wanting to hear to learn from you. I need your help, the humility. And that's how people are coming in, and people are able to gain, people's heart. Because when people, new people come in, they are quite suspicious. Will this person, play to the advantage of me or disadvantage? Is this person really coming to replace me or get me out? There've a lot of suspicions. And so I think it's going to be important that your priority has to win the hearts of the people. And rather than, again, use a lot of questions, exercise humility, you try to learn. And if you feel that you have, well-informed, I don't know, data, you may be able to make certain decisions, again, with people, leveraging on people's experiences, expertise, people who have been in the organization for quite some time. And so that's how you can do it. So it is going to be also very important to also identify who these people who are able to really help you with this, right? People, we call this not only allies, but also confidant who are able to tell you what you should really hear for everyone's success, including you as a boss, right? Identifying them is going to be very important. So I think the key priority has to be knowing how to work with the people, knowing how to survive in that political culture, whatever the culture that has already been ingrained in that organization. And, again, do this one thing at a time, small steps. And of course, you have to also speak with the board members to really kind of ask for time and an understanding. So buying time at the same time winning people's heart will be a critical formula, I think, for people who have been coming in as a parachute. And again, I've worked with different people who have come in because of, some people who are very powerful. Many of them had failed, but, there are people who have survived through and have done really, really great. And that's going to be my advice to them. And that has been to those people who really want to succeed.
Incredible. But to me, what's interesting is what you mentioned about humility, and it is quite important. I just wonder, the trade-off between having humility as a parachute versus losing legitimacy because you don't know enough, or you don't appear to know enough, and appearance and perception is a lot of it, basically, in a lot of those cultures, basically, right? I was wondering, how you sort of train some of your parachutes in kind of maintaining that. Is that more very contextual, or is there specific tactical things that they can do to ensure that?
No, my way of, the framework could be that Leaders have to be extremely self-aware, and you have to be self-aware. We should be assuming that we don't know it all. So therefore, it is very important that, you have your forte, but at the same time, there are also the weaknesses that, knowing your weakness is going to be very important. And again, I keep on mentioning about the timing, knowing when to intervene, knowing when to say things is going to be very important. And that having a sort of a sometimes bottom standpoint, but also as you are on the dance floor, as you are interacting with so many different things, you have to also at the same time simultaneously going, on the balcony, try to observe how you say things, what kind of interventions. Is your interventions really being effective? And so I think self-awareness is going to be extremely important that leaders needs to have. Another thing, it will probably be like one-on-one relationship, like you should be able to really knowing how to cultivate that one-on-one relationship. Then how do you manage a wider group of people? Maybe, 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people. But the lastly, I'd probably say is the business acumen that you need to have. Business acumen is extremely important because you might have an expertise in one area, but, you need to know the whole value chain as well. Right? Especially if you are in a certain important position, that expertise is going to be extremely, important. So end-to-end thinking, big picture thinking like an entrepreneur, right? Being creative, stakeholder management. I think these are the skills that you can pick up. There are some soft side of skills, but also there are hard side of skills. But I think business acumen is going to be extremely important. When I work with leaders, especially people who have come into that position, one of the diagnostic work is going to be that, how much of that business acumen capabilities that you have. And I could coach them, I could then offer them my analysis of where you are at, and therefore what is an immediate, the skills, the knowledge, the expertise that you have to learn, and again, leaders have a lot of burden on them, but time is not on our side. And so therefore you have to go an extra mile to not only develop these people skills, but also the business acumen skills that you have to learn. And again, I say that leadership all begins with diagnostic work, right? Don't assume that you know it. Let's try to diagnose and then see, okay, let's admit the things that you do well, but also admit that the things that you don't, because if you don't improve on these weaknesses of yours, it's going to really bring some negative impact on how you lead and the impact that you're going to cause on the organization. So therefore, it's going to be having that self-awareness and really trying to, build that capability, right? That can put you in a better position to lead.
Yeah, so these are all the good things that you mentioned that should be done by a person, right? So I would put it in a basket of the theory of doing it well.
Yes.
And then the second basket would be experiencing it so that you can learn through on the job kind of situations. But if you put it in the context of a lot of the younger leaders, be in political settings, they are supercharged into those situations, perhaps because they have specific qualities that make them different from other younger people.
Yes.
And hence they are catapulted into those leadership positions without necessarily being ready for it, even though they're charismatic on the other hand, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, the systems that we have so far are not designed for people who are typically catapulted into those positions.
Yes.
In politics, you have to go step by step, like what he mentioned, even in China, in such hierarchical settings, you have to go literally from the bottom all the way up, prove your mark through experience, basically, because it's impossible for you to canvass a lot of support unless you spend a lot of time in it. Even in corporate settings, you'll be rotated across departments. And by the time that you are categorized as a leader, you might be in your mid-40s, for example, or you can be considered for higher positions. So do you think it's the system that we have to change rather than expecting younger people to just pick up all these good qualities along the way as fast as possible? What do you think? What do you think we should change?
No, I think it's a bit of both, right? I mean, the system has to change as the context changes, right? So I think the system has to change as well. The young people as well, right? I mean, I think the adaptation needs to take place in all realms. The young people needs to have the right expectations. They need to know the constraints that we face at the same time, the things that they can do, the things that they can't do. At the same time, I think there has to be some compromises, right? I think in all realms, we need to have some adaptability in all realms. So I think it goes in both ways. Young people who are coming in very talented, having the right expectation is one thing, but at the same time, the corporate leadership or the national leadership needs to also know how to address some of these concerns, address some of these needs, address some of these aspirations that are changing. I think I think the younger generations that are now being put into a workplace, they are coming in with different expectations and different aspirations. It's going to be very important if by the day for a company to attract really quality talent, you have to adapt to a certain extent. But at the same time, the young people needs to have the right expectation of what they are facing, the constraint that they have, and the things that they can do, they can't do, right? So I think there has to be both ways. And I think with both doing it, the capacity to be able to be adaptable is, I think, one of the critical skills that we need to have. And so different organizations, especially in Korea, Japan, and Taiwan that I work with, are, because it's all about talents now, the companies are changing, the systems are changing. Even on a national level, they're bringing in new labor laws to adapt to different needs and the expectations. And so it has to go in all different ways.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually. So Samuel, a lot of our listeners are actually based in the West, and you've also you focus a lot on Asia. So a lot of the folks are interested in learning what are sort of the unique leadership lessons in Asia that you sort of found from thousands and thousands of hours of training that's sort of still relevant to the West. Like what can Asia teach the West, in many ways? Is there anything unique like that you found throughout your trainings?
I think in Asia, I feel that we relatively care for people. And of course, we've got hierarchies and whatnot, but especially I see different organizational culture changing, and especially the companies that are thriving, they put a huge emphasis on people. And I think the collective leadership is becoming a more and more important part of it. And I think Asians are being very good at it. We need to bring people along with you. Maybe people might make mistakes. People might make some errors, but, giving people a chance rather than, hey, you're fired, you're not capable. It's very tricks driven. It's very data driven. Sometimes, especially in times today, I think you still need to keep that human component of it, right? And we should admit that, yeah, people do make mistake. But that's a leadership moment. Rather than firing people off, rather than scolding them, rather than making them lose face, maybe what you can do is that, you can make a mistake, but what can we learn from this? And how can you, do something differently that can really help us to make this, organization even more promising, right? And so I think that's really a leadership moment. And I think in Asia, the loyalty is going to be very important. Young people in Asia, just like the West, are relatively becoming less loyal. But I think, by giving people a chance, that people are becoming, I really like this company. They're not loyal to the people, but they're loyal to the culture. That, I love this company because that company has given me a second chance, third chance. I've been very understanding. That I'm able to try something because I've done it out of good intention. Maybe if they've done it with ill intention, of course, we need to let them go, right? But, kind of like people, and I think that's a beautiful thing. And some of this organization that I work with in Asia that are thriving, one of the patterns I see is that they're very much, in a way, forgiving and really, and in that culture, when other people hear, word of mouth, people are, if this is the culture and if they're really thinking about us as humans, they really want to go along with us, they really do care about us, they want to give more to it. Yeah. And so I think it's going to be I think that's, one of the beautiful things that I see, especially, many of the thriving Asian companies,
Yeah, I think there's a certain, I would say beauty basically that collectivist culture brings, and a lot more heart into the corporate and non-corporate structures as well, versus the more individualism that you see in the sort of West, basically, right? And you have to manufacture a lot of these in an individualistic culture where you have those same things very ingrained in the collectivist cultures, really. I just had one more question, and then I think we've run out of time here. But so Samuel, we're also at the same time as we're having this conversation undergoing some kind of like a fourth or a fifth industrial revolution based on AI, And a lot of the CEOs and boardroom leaders in Asia, as well as people who work in government in Asia, are thinking about AI, and they want to do things with AI and help improve lives of people. So how are you sort of responding to that? I saw the kind of syllabus that you guys have, the day one, day two, I think 2 of those days were very focused on the self and understanding the self, like you mentioned. Like, are you sort of like incorporating any kind of AI skill sets, or like how are you solving the skills gap that a lot of employers kind of talk about in Asia, when they want to recruit fresh grads and so on and so forth? Like, is there anything there? Like, what do you think about it basically?
Yeah, I was in Korea, 2 weeks ago. I was in Korea for 3 weeks, and then I had a very interesting conversation with the people in the Ministry of Education as to how they're really transitioning sort of their K-12 curriculum. And they are, wanting to bring in a new form of education where it's no longer memorizing things and regurgitating things and solving just, a simple problem with one answers. They're wanting to transition to like, hey, even fourth graders, hey, come up with a chemistry textbook, and different people using AI come up with a different textbook and they compare with one another and they get to learn about, the different textbook that they have come up with. Right. And see how we can learn from one another. I think as an AI is a must, very, very critical. I think the companies are always looking for the next big thing. And one of the programs that we run is called a corporate leadership, a program for the future directors. And so it's going to be very important that use of AI is going to be extremely important. We've got different innovations. And, it's going to be very naive thing to do just to rely on human knowledge to think about what's the next big thing for the company. You have to rely on AI. And if you're really able to work with AI, you should be able to ask. You should be able to manipulate AI. You should be able to leverage AI. How do you do that is asking questions. You should be able to really ask a lot of good questions. And so depending on the questions that you ask, different inputs, different responses can be given. Even on the next big thing for the company, you have to keep on conversing with AI. You have to keep on getting insights from the AI, right? So for now, maybe we cannot make a sole judgment solely based on the AI, but there's so much insight that AI can give. And you can do a multidisciplinary research, having a conversation. Maybe you put on a hat as a thinking like a futurist about what are the different possibilities that the future may turn out, right? We call this alternative future. The alternative future, A could happen, B could happen, C could happen. And we got to think about some of the scenarios that could happen. And so therefore, even all these things, it's a distributed leadership. You have to converse, you have to discuss. And the AI has to be one critical component of it. So therefore, everyone, irrespective of the role that you play in your organization, needs to know how to work with AI. And so in our, the programs that we run or, the conferences that we run, place in AI, use of AI, a critical component. And whether you like it or not, we live in times where it's going to be very difficult just for humans to make decisions on their own capacity. You have to leverage on technology, right? And the AI is the critical component of it. And so therefore you have to learn this. And so I strongly recommend that the companies do set a time to ensure that their employees do really know how to use, AI into the part of their decision making in search for the next big thing for the company.
Brilliant. And with that, we'll sort of wrap things up. Samuel, thank you so much for your time today. It was a really interesting and very informative conversation. And so I'm guessing like folks who want to sign up to your program can just go to your website and do that?
Yeah. Well, Hafiz, thank you so much for the opportunity. The program that we offer, unfortunately, we don't provide a public enrollment program, but we do have an event in Seoul in May where people are able to come to the conference. And the conference that we put up is like, we have this aspiration that we want to put up as a Asian form of the World Economic Forum. About 4,000 people that attend, about 1,000 are, the college, university students, because we really want in up and coming leaders, and they need to be informed. They need to learn these things. They need to get exposed. And so therefore, we would warmly welcome people who are interested in coming to this event that's going to be held in May every year. Yeah. And also check us out in our social media, and we can stay in touch in many different ways and forms.
Brilliant.
But much for the opportunity.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Samuel, and thanks, Fizi, for your time as well. Yeah, have a good one.
Thank you. Thank you very much.